Welcome to Imagining Climates, a project of the Guelph Institute of Environmental Research. I'm Catherine Bush, novelist, author most recently of the climate-themed novel Blaze Island. I'm an affiliate member of GEAR. I'm the coordinator of the University of Guelph's Creative Writing MFA, and I'm an associate professor in the School of English and Theater Studies. Liane?
And I'm Liane Miedema Brown. I'm a graduate student at the University of Guelph looking at landscape ecology and plant functional traits. I'm a GEAR early career affiliate. I am an amateur artist and a plant enthusiast.
An all-around amazing collaborator and person. So we're the team leaders of Imagining Climates, and we're here today to talk a little bit about the origins of the project and the ideas behind it. So imagination is a fundamental way of experiencing and learning about the world. While scientific data are necessary for confirming climate science and evidence of changing climates, imagination is as essential in our grappling with the ongoing climate emergency. Climate change exists in the mindscapes of our cultures and societies as much as in the landscapes and oceanscapes of our planet. Our awareness of the perilous changes to our climate and our biosphere are shaped by our understanding, our imagining of the present through the narratives and scenarios we tell ourselves. Our responses are shaped by our ability to imagine a future. The climate emergency is a planetary problem, but it is also fundamentally a human problem. And it requires us to imagine changed futures for ourselves and to mobilize others to do so. So to start this conversation, I'm going to ask Liane to tell me what imagination means to you as a scientist, particularly in the context of the climate crisis.
Yeah, so that's a great question because I think when we first started thinking about this project and I was thinking about what imagination meant to me, my first feeling was of resistance. I really didn't like the thought of imagination in science. A lot of what we deal with is observational things that we can count, very tactile things, and to, I don't know, put imagination into it, the first thought was like a cartoon with a thought bubble happening. Like, this is all very whimsical. But if you take a couple steps back, I think that imagination is actually a very powerful tool that can be used to come up with creative solutions to problems. And that's a lot of what science is you're kind of, you are asking a research question and then you're kind of formulating a response to that. Before this conversation, I actually looked up the definition of imagination because I love definitions. And there are actually several listed that I would like to share here that I think are really relevant to this conversation. Because I don't know, like I said, it's really interesting to look at the definition of things. And the first is the act or power of forming a mental image of something, not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. And I think that when you bring the climate crisis into it, that is something that is very difficult to wholly perceive in reality. It's so widespread, it's happening globally. A lot of what we hear about it is we hear papers, I read papers, you see lots of graphs, but you don't grasp it tactilely. Or you hear stories in the news like of the wildfires happening in California and you're not actually there, you're seeing something far away and you're having to imagine your connection to it. So I think imagination comes in that sense. And the second one listed is the thinking and active mind, which is quite obviously like very connected to science. You're always thinking, you're always kind of brainstorming and coming up with ideas. My lab has these great meetings where sometimes we'll just discuss like someone's research and throw ideas around. And that's very, I find characteristic of a lot of lab settings. And this includes the creative ability and ability to confront and deal with a problem. And I think the climate crisis is perhaps the greatest problem that I know our generation will ever face, and possibly the greatest problem that humanity will face. And so I think that in that sense, having the imagination in your toolkit is essential as a society. So again, it's not just the third definition, which here is the creation of the mind, an idealized or poetic creation or a fanciful, empty assumption. it's not just that, it's actually a really strong and powerful tool.
That's great. I love hearing all those definitions, and they spark all sorts of ideas in my own mind. And I love this
Mhm.
conversation with you too, because in a sense, it is an intergenerational conversation. We're at different parts of our lives and, facing the climate crisis in different ways because of that. I
Mhm.
think of the climate crisis as a mindscape, and as you say, there's something about those indelible images of the Australian wildfires. I imagine, burned koalas trying to cross a road, or those deep red skies over beaches where people are huddling. And it's in those specific images that the climate crisis begins to live inside us, or, huge ice shelves breaking off Antarctica, and one floating towards the island of South Georgia that's as big as the island of South Georgia, and what will happen were they to collide. So again, this imagined self, series of images or scenarios begins to make the climate crisis real for us and live inside us. I'm a storyteller, so I'm interested in how we might fictionalize the climate crisis, and how we might do so not as a dystopia, but in a way that relates more specifically to our lived experience of it now, our own specificities. And so I begin to ask myself, what kind of stories do we need now? Stories that might hold ecological grief, anger, extinction, but also ingenuity and hope, and how we might reintegrate old stories, pre-industrial stories, stories that broaden our sense of community and kinship beyond the human, and bring us back to this sense of a living biosphere and our connection to the plant and animal worlds. And I think about our need for new cultural narratives, again, that might incorporate old narratives, but move beyond cultural narratives of comfort and material acquisition, in which the past resembles the present, and the future might resemble the past, because it may not. So how can we tell stories that move us beyond this place, and motivate us newly, and transform us, which is ultimately what a good story should do. And yeah, and I would just add to your definitions that imagination is an epistemology. It's a way of knowing the world, a way of conceiving the world. And it's also a way for us to imagine a world beyond the human, into deep past, geological past, and a range of possible futures. So again, it brings us into this sense of possible worlds. So yeah, I guess I just wanted to ask you a little more about imagination in your own work as a scientist, if you could talk to that a little bit.
I'd be happy to. I had just one thought that came to mind. I'd like to share before I answer that question. And when you were talking about the importance of story, it just brought to mind actually this. It was a rather campy film that I watched a while ago called Tomorrowland. And I don't remember much about the entire story except for the ending. And it was this really hopeful kind of like landscape of the future, showing lots of young people coming up with creative solutions and like building this beautiful future. And I remember just being completely overcome with emotion. And it was strange because I am not somebody who cries at movies. I don't think I ever have, but I just like, I was bawling watching this. And afterwards I was like, what just happened? But I think it was because it was the first story that I had encountered where the future was hopeful. Because I grew up you read The Handmaid's Tale, or like The Gate to Women's Country, or The Hunger Games, or stories like this where the future is very dystopian and very dark and kind of this hopeless landscape. And then that was the first time where I thought, oh, we can have hope in our future. And I think that was several years ago, and that's just, it's really stuck with me going forward. And there are many stories that I've read since then that are more articulate and I think better told, but that just like really struck me. So I think stories, like you said, are really powerful.
Yeah,
Anyway, yes.
I would just add that, imagination goes beyond story too, and it can be just a potent metaphor or a specific image, or artists have a way of materially transforming their world through the work, which is also an imaginative practice that can transform us when grappling with the climate emergency. So I just wanted to add those possible ways of thinking about imagination, and then ask you again about imagination in your own work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I kind of covered this in the beginning of like that resistance to imagination, and I still think that I don't quite have the vocabulary to explain imagination in science as well. I think it's often used in the arts and less so in the sciences. But I think that one really clear example is a lot of theories that we as scientists develop, especially in ecology, really is kind of imagining a mechanism behind the observations that we see. So the reason behind something, we can't prove 100%, that's not how statistics work. We can prove that there's a correlation, and then we kind of have to imagine what could be causing this, and then use those thoughts to kind of come up with the responses. So I think, yeah, I hesitate to call that imagination, but I do think that is really the creativity that comes into the world of science. My work particularly, it doesn't relate specifically to the climate crisis. I look a lot at landscape change. So I think that's a symptom of the crisis that we're dealing with. But one of the aspects I'm looking at is ecosystem services. And that's a really interesting concept, because ecosystem services are the benefits and services that society gains from natural lands. So it's almost, you can't really measure it. You have to kind of creatively come up with ways to value them, because it's not like, okay, I'm going to go and count the number of trees in this area so I can get the diversity. It's more of a concept in how humans interact with the environment around them. So there's a lot of creativity that comes into that. And I think that it's been interesting to see in the past few years, and in my kind of education as a graduate student, to see this shift in the scientific community from a community of people very comfortable making observations towards a lot of the people who are studying the climate crisis becoming more people coming up with creative solutions, and kind of stepping into that imaginative world of how, so we've done this study, now how do we implement it? What can we do to take 2 steps forward and actually make a change? And I think that I'm really, really excited to see where that goes in the next couple of years. And as people have already started doing that, and as I become part of that community to step into that role. Yeah, so that's something I'm really excited about.
Oh, that's great. That's fabulous to hear. And yeah, story is so essential to so many disciplines, being able to construct a compelling narrative. And I'm so interested in cross-disciplinary collaborations. And certainly there have always been a lot of scientists in my fiction throughout my career. Blaze Island specifically grapples with the life of a climate scientist who flees to a remote island in the North Atlantic with his young daughter. And the novel tries to hold his grief, his climate grief, rage and despair, and his desire to protect his daughter, and the lengths that he will go to protect her. And I also really wanted to create a fictional world in which the balance between the human and the more than human worlds are readjusted, so that the natural elements are amplified and the human story really takes place within them. So the human story isn't centered as much, because I really feel that that's important in terms of how we think about ourselves in relation to the rest of the world as we move forward. And also, I was really interested in some of the ethical issues of climate science, and with a particular focus on climate engineering or climate interventions, and on the specific technique of solar radiation management, sending particulates into the upper atmosphere to cool the temperatures, globally cool temperatures. as happens with volcanoes. But there is contemporary scientific research being done in this field, but it's also very contentious. And and the question is, who gets their hands on this technology and who decides how it's applied? And it has, appealed to capitalists and others. And so all those ethical issues interested me. And so, I'm interested in fiction in its broadest sense, in how stories grapple with the climate crisis. And I wouldn't, say there's never one way to do it. And often it can be a specific image that resonates through a work. There's a novel by a friend of mine, Martha Bailey, in which one of the characters all has a kind of tinnitus, in which he constantly hears the sound of melting glacial waters in his ears. The Search for Heinrich Schlogel is the name of the novel. But again, a single image like the toothbrush, my 15-year-old niece telling me that all the plastic toothbrushes that ever existed in the world will still exist for 500 years. They'll outlast us all. And that was just such a specific and indelible way of thinking about the ecological costs of plastic. And again, a toothbrush seems so small and ordinary and disposable, but yet has such a life. And so again, things like that can be so sticky and potent. Or the metaphor of the bathtub, which my climate scientist sister told me about, thinking about CO2 in the atmosphere as a kind of bathtub situation where you can fill the bathtub quite quickly with water, but if you take out the drain, it drains very slowly. So even if we were to stop using fossil fuels immediately, it will take a long time for CO2 to dissipate in the atmosphere. And again, there's something sticky about that specific metaphor, which allows us to understand the problem in ways that we might not if it's just described in scientific terms. So I'm always looking for metaphors and images like that beyond the story.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's such a great example of the importance of cross-disciplinary projects like this, because it's the scientists who are doing the research to have facts about the lifespan of a toothbrush and the causes of the climate crisis, like CO2 in the atmosphere. But in order to have it stick in the minds of people and to have them engage and realize the impact that their everyday actions, like buying a plastic versus a bamboo toothbrush, are going to have, you need metaphors like that. And so I think a project like Imagining Climates is such a great one to have a platform to kind of share and to share ideas with, like you sharing your ideas with me and me kind of talking about my experience together, and then hopefully having more people come in and talk about their own experiences.
Yes, I love hearing about your experiences, and I love your phrase of the lifespan of a toothbrush. Itself,
Mhm.
a little story. So, um,
Mhm.
so Liane, what's our vision for imagining climates? Can we
Yeah. So I think it's part of what I just said is this idea of having a platform. So originally, actually, Imagining Climates was envisioned to be a 2-day symposium. We were going to have a panel of people. We were going to do some workshops. But like many things with the current pandemic, which has just forced a lot of things online, we've switched to an online platform. And we're developing a web page to host some creative responses to climate, some conversations like this one between disciplines. And so I think I have our vision statement here that we actually will have on the website, and that is, this project seeks to be a multidisciplinary, collaborative, and creative response to the climate crisis, exploring the role of imagination in understanding our world today and creating the world of tomorrow. So we're hoping to have individual thinkers and researchers in a variety of fields to use these imaginative practices that they use in their fields of study and in their work to respond to the climate crisis and the biospheric crisis.
Great, thank you. That's fantastic. And again, there's an emphasis in the project on cross-disciplinary dialogue, as we're engaging in here, and thinking about it as a way to spark new connections positively new imaginative modes for responding to the climate crisis, offering us new ways to reframe it so that we can enter our present predicament more deeply and potentially shape future outcomes and responses. And we want to highlight all the amazing work that's going on at the University of Guelph in environmental research in a range of disciplines at the moment. Um, so yes, we have asked other writers and scientists to respond in the form of tiny microclimate stories, and they'll be on the website. We've invited artists to respond through images, and we hope to engage others, you, the public, in climate imagining and futures imagining. Through writing your own microclimate story or listening to these conversations. And so we hope this imagining invites transformation, changed ways of being and doing. And thank you for joining us on this journey.